Hey everyone, I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Molkowski, and this is the Breeders' Cup edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. The entries are out, post positions drawn, PPs are ready for you to peruse, and Craig, it's time to start solidifying those handicapping opinions.
It is, and I imagine most people have already started, probably did even before the draw, but now it's time to get serious. All the little stuff's taken care of. We know exactly which horses are running and which races, which posts they drew. We even have morning lines from our friend Nick Tamaro, so I am ready to roll.
And similar to last year, Craig and I are going to not do a traditional handicapping discussion where we just give picks in the races. I think both Craig and I probably don't have all of our picks set just yet. I still have a little bit of work to do on a few of these races, but we're going to follow the same pattern that we did last year when we did this show, where we're going to talk about these races through three different lenses. We're going to start by discussing some noteworthy pace scenarios in races that figure to have extreme pace situations, including a few of the 2-year-old races on the Friday card and a number of the Saturday races that have horses with a lot of early speed, or maybe some that don't have that much early speed. We'll talk about them from both angles. Then we'll move on to talk about some of the favorites that might be beatable. We'll talk about all of the heavy favorites over the 2-day period and give our opinions on them, and some of the favorites throughout the other races that may be a little bit more lukewarm that we're looking to fade a little bit. And then the third phase of our discussion will just to be going through the races and highlighting some long shots that have preliminarily caught our interest and horses we might be looking to include somewhere if they're the right price later in the week. So, Craig, let's just dive right into some of those Friday races and start talking about the pace situations. And I know that one that you were intrigued by was the first Breeders' Cup race on that Friday card, the Juvenile Turf Sprint. Not a race that has a pace projector showing up in the TimeformUS PPs, but when you just look down the TimeformUS pace ratings of the American runners, you kind of get the sense they're going to be moving up front.
They are, and I will say of all the races, the Friday races are obviously the toughest because they're all for the juveniles, and for the most part, juveniles tend to win up closer to the front than your traditional races. So you're going to get a lot of races that look like maybe the pace is fast, and maybe it won't play out that way. A lot of horses haven't really established a running style yet, but we've got some really fast horses in this Juvenile Turf Sprint. Some of it will depend on how they handle turf. When you have a horse like Tyler's Tribe, who has run nothing but holes in the wind at Prairie Meadows, winning all of his starts by open lengths with big speed figures. You have a horse like Speedboat Beach, who seemed to handle turf but didn't run anywhere near the same speed figure the second time out when he tried the lawn. But he still showed some high speed. We have a horse who I believe is the favorite among the Americans anyway, in Love Reigns, Wesley Ward's horse, who hasn't been right on the lead in her last win, but she's been right up there both times, and overseas she ran as well and led the race. So this just seems like a race that's going to be extremely fast early. Now, it doesn't mean that a deep closer is going to win this race. It's only 5.5 furlongs. These are juveniles. But I do think you got to look at it and think some of these horses are going to be adversely affected depending on how the lead shakes out.
Yeah, I think one of the intriguing aspects of this race is that arguably 4 of the fastest horses in this field are drawn right alongside each other in the 4 outside gates. Craig, you mentioned those 2 horses with the fast dirt speed, Tyler's Tribe as well as Speedboat Beach, but to their inside you've got Sharp as Attack, who you would think would want to be forwardly placed. I know he stalked last time, but he had shown high speed in his first couple of starts on the turf, and we have to talk about how this pace situation could impact the Platinum Queen, one of the European contenders, who is drawn all the way on the outside. And if you watch her races, she's a horse that likes to race as a front runner, but it's going to be tough to get to the lead with those 3 fast males drawn to her inside.
Agree, and it's just one of these things I've learned over the years is speed in turf sprints. The Americans are simply faster. It's not a big surprise. I mean, I think that's pretty much known in sprint racing on any surface. But we've seen a lot of Europeans come over and not fare very well in these races. The Platinum Queen is one who is actually the morning line favorite, and I think is going to be a bit overhyped on that off of that win at Longchamp. When she won the Group 1, it was a 2-year-old and up race, so a lot was made that she was beating older horses. But I think you got to do a little deeper dive on that. There's a reason that race is written for 2-year-olds and up. There's a huge weight disparity. And she got just a tremendous weight break in that race. And in addition, the course was just a total bog. And I mean, just common sense is going to tell you a lighter horse who's not going to sink into the ground is going to get over it better. And which horse is going to be lighter than a 2-year-old filly?
Yeah, I agree with that assessment, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of our hopefully clever opinions in this race a bit later in the podcast when we circle back around to talk about some of our bigger priced opinions, but I think Craig and I are pretty much on the same page about how this pace is going to shape up on the front end, as well as how it's going to affect the Platinum Queen, who just seems like she's got a pretty difficult trip coming to her. And do take note, if there's any defection from this race, the number 13 on the also eligible list, Bushido, would draw in, and he is yet another extremely fast horse that just blasts out of the starting gate at Woodbine. So this pace just looks like, any way you break it down, it's supposed to be pretty fast on the front end. As Craig said, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to fall apart, and the horse that's 12th in the early going is going to win the race, because it's tough for that to happen in a 5.5 furlong turf sprint. But you just do want to be wary of these horses that have shown the propensity to need the lead in the past, because it's going to be tough to get to that position on the front end. Craig, let's move on to another race that has a pace situation that's worth talking about, and it's actually the second Breeders' Cup race they're going to run on that Friday card, the Juvenile Fillies. We've got a full field signed on for this one, 14 runners, and as I scan this field, it seems like there are quite a few that want to achieve forward position.
I would agree with that as well, and the big field is obviously going to have something to do with that. We have a fairly short run into the first turn at Keeneland for these 1:16 races. It is a 1:16 track, if memory serves. And it's just, you got to get position early, and we have some fast horses in here. And I think it's going to come down to the riders and which are most aggressive, because you don't want to be caught 3 or 4 wide going into the first turn.
Yeah, and we can see the TimeformUS pace projector for this race. No surprise to see that red flag showing up for the fast pace, and kind of surprised to see that there's a horse shown with such an advantage early on, the number 2, You're My Girl, but I get why. She was setting a pretty fast pace last time in the Frisette. She's stretching out to the 2 turns for the first time, so the pace projector is always going to have a horse that's gone shorter in the past as a little bit faster than those who have been running the 2 turn distances. She's likely to go forward from the rail, Craig. I can't imagine they're going to take back a horse like this. John Velasquez, he's one that likes to get his position going forward, but there are certainly others to her outside that will want to be aggressively ridden from the gate, particularly the number 9, Grand Love, who showed a lot of speed in her first start and is one that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, because I think she's a price horse that you might want to consider, but I'll make that case a little bit later in the podcast. But as you just go through this field, Craig, it does feel like this is one, even with that short stretch run, where you might want to consider some horses coming from off the pace.
Yeah, it's just a matter of figuring out who they're going to be, which, as I said, it's not always tough, not always easy with these 2-year-olds. I personally was a little surprised Grand Love was actually entered off that race in the Pocahontas, but she was a horse who was even money in that race. There's obviously some talent, so I'm not going to argue with Steve Asmussen giving her a shot, and I think that's actually a good sign. But it's just that, for me, it's hard to imagine that this race isn't going to be quick early.
Yeah, and just take note of the position of the morning line favorite, the number 10, Chocolate Gelato. She drew pretty far outside in post 10, so I would imagine her connections are going to be looking to use a little bit of her early speed, which she does have plenty of. She went to the lead in a 6 furlong race when she broke her maiden at Saratoga 2 back, so they're going to have to get a little bit more aggressive with her than maybe they were thinking otherwise, drawing that outside post position, because there's not much of a run into the first turn in this 1:16 configuration at Keeneland. Let's move on to the other dirt race for the 2-year-olds on that Friday card, the Juvenile. And Craig, we'll talk a little bit more about the likely, I should say, the almost assured heavy favorite in this race, Cave Rock, and whether or not he's a single on the Friday card. But he is a very fast horse. It's not clear that he's going to be all alone on the front end here, because we do have some pretty quick horses stretching out in here, particularly the number 1, Hurricane J, who seems like he's got to be committed to going from his inside post position.
Right, the post draw certainly made that almost he has to go for Pablo Lobo. Drawn inside, again, the same distance as the Juvenile Fillies, 1.16 miles, so a fairly short run to the first turn. Not as short as the mile races, obviously, but it's still not a long run. And Cave Rock's interesting. What I found interesting in this pace projector is the horse drawn to the outside, National Treasure, is also shown right up alongside. And I think we can be pretty confident that that horse is not going to go and press Cave Rock.
I would agree with that. They are adding blinkers to National Treasure for this race, which was a little bit interesting, though he did wear them in his career debut, and I think they probably just took off the blinkers last time to get him to relax a little bit, his first time trying the two-turn distance. But I agree, it would be pretty surprising if the other Baffert trainee went on some suicide mission to press Cave Rock. And I saw some chatter on Twitter that maybe Hurricane J could be a real thorn in the side of Cave Rock, but Craig, I would imagine that Juan Hernandez is just going to be looking to stalk outside of that foe. I can't fathom that he'd be getting in some heated duel with a horse that could be close to 99-1 in this race.
Of the races we're going to talk about, even though this one has the red flag, it's not one I'm going to be looking for deep closers just because of what you say. Hurricane J is quick, but he's also a horse that I don't think the rider of Cave Rock's going to be too concerned with, Juan Hernandez. I imagine he's just going to sit off his flank. He could probably sit a length or two off if need be, if that one goes crazy on the front end. National Treasure's the most likely other speed horse. I would imagine he's probably going to be looking to tuck in behind. So for me, I think it's going to be a pretty easy trip for Cave Rock despite that red flag.
Well, unsurprisingly, with the 2-year-old races, there's a lot of speed signed on in these races, so we just talked about 3 potential fast-paced situations. I think we have more of a mixed bag on Saturday, Craig. There are some races that do appear to have a lot of early speed, some that might not have as much early speed as we once thought, with some late withdrawals from a few of these races. We'll talk about that in just a bit. But let's start things off with yet another fast-paced situation, the first Breeders' Cup race on that Saturday card, the Fillies and Mares Sprint, and I was not surprised to see this fast pace flag showing up in the pace projector because as you go through this field, there are just some pretty fast fillies and mares in here. Slammed, having drawn the inside, and Edgeway right outside of her. They both want to be forward. The number 10, Hot Pepper, she is an extremely fast 3-year-old filly who arguably doesn't have the form to really class up with these, but she is always contesting the lead in her races, so she's one that's likely to go forward, and there's even more speed drawn to her outside, so it just seems it's hard to believe that they're not really moving up front in this Filly and Mare Sprint.
I agree, and there's some speed drawn to the outside as well in Lady Rocket and even Echo Zulu, who has basically won all of her races when she's right up or on or near the lead. It's not like she's ever shown a big closing kick in her races other than drawing away when she set the pace. So this is one I'm in total agreement with the pace projector. I don't see any way that things don't heat up on the front end.
I did not plan to talk about her when we go through our potential vulnerable favorites, so I'll just mention her right now. Goodnight Olive was established as the lukewarm morning line favorite in this race. I think she's 3-1 on Nick's morning line, which seems about right to me. And Craig, I'd be most concerned about her with this pace projector because she's a horse that does like to get that stalking trip, just a length or two off the leaders, not always in races that feature the fastest early paces. And when I look at this pace projector, the thing that jumps out at me is Goodnight Olive is shown all the way back in 6th place early, and that seems about right. It feels like there are horses in here that could just outrun her to the front end, and she might find herself in a somewhat unfamiliar position here.
And she's ridden by Irad Ortiz, who obviously is one of the best riders in the game, but he is not known for his aggressiveness in dirt sprints, that I'm sure. So it wouldn't surprise me if she was much further back than she's been in the past. And since we're not going to talk about her too much later as one of the vulnerable favorites, I'll say I'm always a little leery of what I call one-number horses. She came into that ballerina without ever really having run a very fast race, which is why she was 5-1 that day. She did explode to up into the 120s, but I'm just always leery about horses like that just have the one big race.
Yeah, we'll come back to this race, I think, when we talk about some price horses, because I get the sense that both Craig and I might be looking to go in different directions here. But I think we have a similar view of Goodnight Olive, that while she can certainly win this race if she repeats her ballerina, she's going to have things not go quite the same way here. She got that perfect outside draw last time in the ballerina, never really had to deal with any of the kickback that others to her inside were forced to contend with. So very different situation for Goodnight Olive in this Filly and Mare Sprint, and maybe one that you want to keep an open mind about with regard to price on some long shots. Let's move on to another pace situation that might look a little bit different, Craig. The next sprint on this Saturday card in the next race is the Turf Sprint. And, it always surprises me when there's not a whole lot of speed that draws into these races for the turf sprinters, but yet again, it just feels like Golden Pal is probably going to be loose on the front end, and I guess if you're trying to beat him, you just have to wonder if he's not the same horse that he was in previous years, but I was a little disappointed when I saw this field because I'm just kind of wondering who was going to go after him in the early going.
The pace projector has him on a pretty clear lead, open length lead, and it's hard to argue with it. I'm not sure what happened in the Troy when I know both of us didn't really like what we saw from him that day despite winning. It seems like Wesley Ward was intent on trying rating tactics for some reason. He went back to the usual plan of bust out of the gate, and I thought he ran fine. He ran a 124 speed figure, which is, other than his Breeders' Cup win last time, was about as fast as he's ran. And whether you think he's going to win or not, it's hard to argue that anyone's going to be able to keep up with him early.
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of whether or not Golden Pal beats himself in this race, which he's done before, although not on American soil. And he's likely to be outwinging in the lead. I mean, he just has that gate speed that might not be as potent as it once was, but he still can get out of the gate and show speed in these races. And he's likely to be up a couple lengths on this field early because the likes of the number 14 Artemis City Limits, I mean, he's probably the most likely candidate to go after Golden Pal early. And he's just not nearly as fast as that horse. I think we saw that last time. So I think if you were looking to take a firm stand against Golden Pal, this pace projector might give you some cause for pause.
Exactly. One of the things I like to do when I see a clear open leader like we show him is just look at the horses tucked in behind and wonder if there's maybe something that the pace projector's not able to interpret that would have them closer. But when I look and see horses like Arrest Me Red, Caravel, and Artemis City Limits, it's just hard to see. They're just not as fast as him. We saw it with Artemis City Limits when they faced off. And the other two, I would argue, they're not even really front runners. They can be on occasion, but most of them, the other two do their best racing, either pressing or if they're up front in a much slower pace.
Well, Craig, let's move on to a couple of dirt races in the middle of this Saturday card of Breeders' Cup events, the Dirt Mile and the Sprint. And I'm going to call it right now, Craig. I think that the Dirt Mile is going to feature a faster opening quarter than the Sprint. And I think you might agree with me, just given the past mile races that we've seen at Keeneland. There's a long run-up for these. A lot of the races run around the turn. And I think the jockeys know they've got to be pretty aggressive coming out of that starting gate if they're going to get the position that they want.
I wouldn't take that bet because I agree with you. I think they're going to be flying for a couple reasons. One, this is the shortest run to the turn at just a mile, despite that ridiculously long run-up. I believe it's a 70-yard run-up in this race, so they're already at top speed when the timer starts. And particularly in a race where they're going to want to get forward early inside position if at all possible. And we have plenty of speed as well. And looking at the pace projector, it's not like we have clear speed, like we know which horse it's going to be. It's going to come down to tactics, aggressiveness from the riders. But I do think we're going to see it because that's really the only chance you have in this race to win.
However, this is one of those races where, as fast as they go on the front end, I'm not sure if you can rely on the closers to have success in this race because it's a weird situation at Keeneland where they've got a short run to the first turn and a short stretch. So most of the races is run around the turns, and just kind of watching some past dirt miles, especially the most recent one where Nick's Go won at Keeneland, they're just kind of merry-go-round races, and the speed doesn't always come back. So sometimes the best place to be is out in front, avoiding that trouble, not having to go wide on the turns. So this is a weird situation where, even though I expect an extremely hot pace, I don't know if I'd want to be too confident in the closers here.
Yeah, if I was going to go against horses I expect to be on the front end, it's ones that I want tucked right in behind, who are going to be able to start making that move into the pace, maybe going into that second turn, because if you wait till you're midway on the turn or coming off the stretch, it's probably too late.
Yeah, so it's an unusual Breeders' Cup race. Probably not the intention to run this race around 2 turns with a short stretch, but unfortunately that's what we're stuck with at Keeneland. And Craig, as for the sprint, which is going to be run 2 races after the dirt mile, going the 6 furlong distance, I mean, unfortunate that we're not going to see the big matchup of Jackie's Warrior and Jack Christopher. Unfortunately, there's just that situation with the vets in Kentucky, and I can't fault vets for being overly cautious. There have just been some known issues with Jack Christopher, and even if he's a sound horse, not always galloping or moving like to the vet's satisfaction. So at least they've been upfront about that, and they were honest with the connections that he's likely to be a scratch. So I can't be upset with Chad Brown for declaring him out of the race early. It's certainly better than doing it at the last minute. So we're not going to get to see that matchup, and it just kind of sucks some of the air out of this race, because it once again looks like Jackie's Warrior is going to be a huge favorite.
I would agree, and we're talking about the pace scenario now, so it's kind of hard to imagine him not being in the front end. I would argue that the 2 horses who were most likely to give him a run in the sprint didn't show up in the sprint. They're in the dirt mile. But and when we're talking about pace, it's another one where I look at the pace projector, and the horse shown in behind him is Super Ocho, a horse who's 30-1 on the morning line. He's not led in his last couple races. The time he did was just in an allowance race. A horse like Willie Boy, who's run at Gulfstream for the most part, showed up at Saratoga in the Vanderbilt, was no match for Jackie's Warrior that day in a race where he didn't go particularly fast. So I can't see anyone challenging Jackie's Warrior early.
Yeah, I concur with that. I mean, the pace projector, I think, speaks for itself with this one. I mean, Super Ocho is just not really a threat to Jackie's Warrior, and especially now that Jackie's Warrior has drawn outside of that foe. Even if Super Ocho wants to go fast up front, we know that Jackie's Warrior can sit outside of a horse and basically take over at will. So just seems like a perfect situation for him, the way that this Breeders' Cup Sprint has set up on paper. Let's move on to the last dirt race on that Saturday card, Craig. It is the Classic, and I love the way this pace projector shaped up. I mean, as you know, this is just what the algorithm spit out. No one's moving these chiclets around to, suit the fans, but it is pretty cool to see both Life is Good and Flightline coming into this race with almost exactly the same TimeformUS early pace rating.
If I hadn't seen the pace projector and you asked me how this race was going to look heading into the first turn, that's exactly how I'd have drawn it up. Life is Good, maybe on a slight lead, Flightline a neck behind him, no more, and probably a pretty big gap. Maybe Hot Rod Charlie would be tucked in right behind in the pocket, not quite as far back as the pace projector shows, but I think they're clearly the 2 fastest horses, and it's almost unavoidable that they're going to hook up pretty soon after the start.
Yeah, and I think the big question mark is how they hook up in this race, because horses can race alongside each other and not necessarily be engaged in a duel. And I think we saw that last time at the Pacific Classic, where Flavien Prat just sort of kept Flightline out in the center of the racetrack. There were horses that were within a length of him along the inside, but he clearly was not engaged with those horses. He was just kind of running in his own race outside. And I'd imagine they're going to try to do the same thing with Flightline, Craig, especially now that he's drawn outside of Life is Good, and there's not that worry about getting pinned down inside, kind of like he was in the Met Mile, where he had to alter course around another horse like Speaker's Corner. He can just basically set up shop in the 3 or 4 path, and if Life is Good wants to go out too fast, he can let him do so.
You make a great point, because I'm not so sure. The conventional wisdom seems to be that Life is Good is going to get cooked and quit. And I'm not so sure, because I don't think these 2 are going to go out and go 45. We saw that Flightline can rate. He doesn't have to be speed crazy. He just has a naturally high cruising speed. And he the rider may be perfectly content just to sit off of Life is Good for 8 furlongs of a 10 furlong race. So I'm not as willing to just chalk it up that Life is Good is going to get dueled into defeat and back up through the field. I don't know how much value there is in that opinion, but I also don't want to get too crazy trying to just predict a complete pace meltdown, because as you say, there's only 2 of them up there. If you want to think Hot Rod Charlie can keep up with them and maybe engage, I guess it's possible, but he hasn't really shown that kind of talent before.
Yeah, I anticipate to see much more of a chess match as these horses proceed through the stretch for the first time, or maybe even the first half mile of this race. I don't think they're going to go crazy at that point. Maybe when they get onto the backstretch, we'll start to see these 2 go after each other a little bit more. That's the point in the race when Flightline usually asserts himself. But I don't think that through the stretch the first time we're going to see that kind of duel materialize. Well, we've taken you through most of the interesting or extreme pace situations on the Saturday card. And, Craig, as we're going through this, I realize I skipped over one that I meant to put in the rundown, so let's just briefly backtrack. I did mean to discuss the Breeders' Cup Distaff, because this is one that kind of might swing in the opposite direction of not having that extremely fast pace that we expect to see in a few other of the 2-turn races. Looking at this pace projector, the number 8, Society, just looks like she is going to be out wigging as fast as she wants to go or as slow as she wants to go on the front end, because it doesn't seem like there are too many to press her in that distaff.
Yeah, I wasn't going to let you off the hook, because I think this is one of the more fascinating ones, because I think it's very tough to predict. We do have Society, who I do think will lead. I don't think there's a whole lot of doubt about that. But I think it's going to come down to search results and what Flavien Prat's tactics are with that one and how soon he wants to engage. Because we've seen it a few times in the past where he's engaged a little early in these top class races and it hasn't worked out very well. He keeps getting run down once by Malathaat, once by Clariere and Malathaat, and you could say, she's won the battle but lost the war. But she's kind of in the same exact scenario again, so I'm just not sure what he's going to do. It would seem kind of pointless to take it to Society early, but I just don't know a good strategy for search results that could put her in the winner's circle, and I do think that's going to influence the pace. My guess is they're going to be a little more content to just wait back and try to make a late run.
Yeah, we've talked about it a few times this year where search results is in that position, and I think you framed it well. It's the same thing. And I guess the big difference here is in the personal ensign last time for search results, I suppose you could have some confidence that Latruska was going to come back to you because she just hasn't really been in top form this year, and they rode her like they weren't really that concerned about Latruska for the first 6 furlongs or so of the race, and then he made that move to challenge at the quarter pole. I think you might have to be a little more worried about Society because unlike Latruska, she's coming into this race in top form, and we saw what she can do last time in the cotillion if you kind of let her open up that lead on the far turn. So I do think that Flavien Prat's going to have to keep her in his sights if he wants to have a chance on search results.
Yeah, and I have no argument with that. And this is Keeneland. I don't think it's not a track where you can run down easily a loose quality front runner. It's going to be tough, and some of the favorites in here are horses who do like to come from behind. And I do think the wild card is Nest. She's a horse who did show really high speed in that Coaching Club of America Oaks. She's kind of backed away from that, but I just wonder if maybe if they turn the screws on her early, if she could be up closer than what we show in the pace projector.
Well, since we're towards the end of the Saturday card here, having talked about all of the pace situations that we wanted to discuss, let's start to go back through these races in the opposite direction and talk about a few of the favorites in these races that we might be leaning on or might be looking to try to beat. And let's go back to that last race on Saturday, Craig, the Classic, with regard to Flightline. Do you think this is a race where you want to take the negative opinion or be somewhat skeptical of Flightline, or is he just going to be a single for you? Because it seems like at this point with Flightline, you've got to go in one of two directions. You're either for or against.
I don't see how you can try to beat him in this race. As a speed figure guy, he's been fast from day one. Other than his debut, he's cracked the 130 mark every time. He ran a 150 plus last time, and maybe you could argue with that figure a little bit, and it's a 146 instead. what difference does it make at that level? I just don't see him losing. I think if you're betting against him, you're just guessing, to be honest, because watching his workouts, it's just I don't see anybody touching him in this field.
Yeah, I know both you and I were kind of not sure what to do with him in that Pacific Classic, and we tried to take the value-minded approach of just basically, going against and waiting to see what he did at that 10 furlong distance. Well, we saw, and I think we got the answer that day, that, we could have a little confidence. And if he runs that same kind of race or anything close to it in this Breeders' Cup Classic, he's just not going to get beat, and he's probably going to put on quite a show once again. So I agree, it's pretty hard to take a stand against Flightline here. I mean, the only horse that I could even get remotely interested in, I think, is Epicenter, but he'd have to take yet another step forward off his Travers victory, and Flightline would have to regress for him to have any sort of chance. And I just don't know if I feel like he can bridge that gap, as talented a horse as Epicenter is.
Same for me, and I would almost put Taiba in the same class. I think he's probably every bit as good as Epicenter, but he's also a lot less lately raced. He doesn't have the foundation, and he also draws the inside post, which I don't think is ideal given the two speeds in here. So, yeah, for me, I'm not sure how I'm going to play the race, if I'll even bother with verticals, but, sometimes you don't want to beat your head against the wall. I'm not trying to beat him. Flightline.
Is there any scenario where Flightline just, takes that first quarter a little too easy, lets Life is Good get away, and maybe Life is Good springs a surprise here? Do you think there's the possibility of that, or is this just the wrong race for Life is Good?
I think Life is Good had to take the shot here. There's no point trying a different race. I just don't. Short of Flightline just not showing up and something going wrong, and he's not the same horse we saw at Del Mar, I just don't see any way that he's going to be able to fight him off through the lane.
Well, let's go back to that distaff that we were just talking about, Craig. And, we mentioned that Society is supposed to have the right kind of setup here, and maybe it's in the hands of search results a little bit as to whether or not she gets that loose lead that she was able to enjoy last time in the Cotillion. How are you viewing Nest and the kind of trip she's going to get, and also whether or not she's going to offer any kind of value in this race? Because it does seem like the general public is settling upon this opinion that Nest might just be a class above all of her older foes in this race. Do you share in that view, or do you think Nest could be overbet here?
No, I definitely think she will be overbet. Can she win? Of course. She's a very, very good filly, one of the best we've seen in a while. But her speed figures are right around the same as what we've seen from Clairiere and Malathaat, and even Society in her last race. And that one's going to have an advantage. I just think Ness is going to have to be ridden pretty aggressively early. I don't think she's going to want to try to outkick Malathaat or Clairiere in the lane if we get the same Clairiere that we saw in the late spring and early summer. Last time she certainly had an excuse in that personal ensign. We haven't seen her since, so I think she's a bit of a question mark. But for me, Nest will be an underleg. Can she win? Like I said, of course she can win. She's very good. I'd really like to see her ridden aggressively in here and keep Society within a couple lengths. I could just kind of have to see where search results goes. But I don't think you want to let this horse get 5 lengths off the pace.
Yeah, I'm a little torn on this one, Craig. I've got to be honest, because I do veer more towards that view that Nest is just a little better than everybody else in this field. And maybe I'm getting a little swayed by the visually impressive nature of her last few victories, but I mean, she has won these races so easily. The margins don't even come close to capturing how dominant she's been. I mean, she's got these races wrapped up at the 8th pole, and the last few times Arad Ortiz has just geared her down to the wire. I mean, this is a situation where maybe she could have actually run a little faster in a few of these races. I mean, she has just been utterly dominant. It's a big step up in class, from facing Secret Oath in first act to now being in against her high-class stablemate Malathaat as well as Clairiere. I mean, she really is going to have to run her A race here, but the handiness that she possesses, the turn of foot that she showed in her last few races, I feel like it's going to give her the upper hand over horses like Malathaat and especially Clairiere, who I think is interesting coming in here, maybe with some people having gone off her bandwagon for that poor effort last time. But Clairiere could be the one that's most affected by the lack of pace in this race. It is her stablemate Society that's supposed to be out in front, but I don't think Steve Asmussen thinking about Society like some kind of rabbit for Clairiere. They're both in here to win the race. So I think Nest is the most likely winner. If you put a gun to my head, I would say that. But what's the fair odds on her? I feel like she's going to get bet down maybe to the 7-5 range or potentially lower than that. And that's a little short for me.
That's exactly my thinking. If you could get 2-1 or 9-5, that borderline might be a bet, or maybe at least fair odds on her. I think that would be fair. But I'm with you. I think she's probably going to be more in the 6-5 range. So this for me may be the most fascinating race on the card as a fan, not necessarily as a bettor. I don't think we're going to get a huge price come in. Maybe you get a decent payoff if you like Society and she's able to hold on, but I don't think it's going to be big balloons like we saw in the Distaff last year. But just as a fan of the sport, this is what a championship race should be. We have all the horses who should be in this race are in this race. We have all different running styles, good tactics. So this is going to be one of my favorite races on Saturday, no matter how it turns out.
I completely agree with that. It's one of the races that I'm most looking forward to. The Distaff and the Classic, it should really be quite a showdown. The right horses are running in both of those, even though the fields are not that large. Let's talk about a few of the other Saturday races that we haven't spent a whole lot of time on yet. We'll get to the turf in just a little bit. I think we'll touch upon that at the end of the podcast, but I'm not really looking at it from the pace or vulnerable favorite angle. But let's move on to the Breeders' Cup Mile, Craig, for the next race, because the number 4 Modern Games, Nick pegged him at 7-2 on the morning line. I'm not going to be surprised when this horse goes off a couple ticks shorter than that. It just feels like a lot of people view him as strictly the horse to beat in this race. Is that how you're taking? Is that how you're viewing Modern Games? That he just is maybe a class above these mile contenders?
You know, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, he did have the big win at Woodbine. I do worry he just ran 3 weeks ago over a pretty demanding course at Ascot. He did run a good second. Now he's got to ship over here again. His time form ratings and his speed figures, they're not all that dominant over some of the others in here. And I'm with you. I'm not knocking the morning line at all. It's a big field of 14 horses, so I'm not sure how low Modern Games would drift. Maybe the absolute 4 would be 5-2 in a field so big. But I think there's some others who are interesting in here that I'm willing to take a shot at much bigger prices.
Yeah, I'm viewing this mile as one of the more wide-open races across the 2 days. Modern Games can certainly win, and I think you can make the argument that he's a horse that might be much better on firmer turf, and he didn't get that last time at Ascot and the Queen Elizabeth. That was a much softer ground, maybe, than even the official course rating would indicate. So maybe that just wasn't him at his best, and we've seen what he can do on firm turf in the past, particularly in his 2 North American starts. Though, Craig, I feel like, the horses that race in North America tend to take more money than those that don't in these races at times, and I feel like people are going to have that Woodbine romp fresh in their memory, and maybe that does knock down his price a little bit, and I wouldn't want to take any shorter than 7-2 on this horse. I just think this is way too wide open a race for that.
Totally agree, and I guess we should talk about a couple that or are we going to do that later, talk about maybe some long shots?
You can mention some now. I mean, we can also circle back to these races, though we do have a lot to talk about with long shots. So why don't we wrap up our mile discussion right now? And you mentioned some horses that are interesting you.
Yeah, the one that interests me the most is a horse I know you liked the last time that he won, and that's just because he's kind of a new horse. I don't want to see Ivar again or Order of Australia. They're good horses. I don't think that they're horses I want to try to beat Modern Games with, but I like what I saw from Annapolis last time over this very course in the Coolmore Turf Mile. He's a 3-year-old who just keeps improving his speed figures, and we don't often see a 3-year-old run a 125 on the turf. It's been a while since I can remember that happening. This horse has always had a huge reputation. He always gets pounded at the windows. I'm not sure if he'll quite be 10-1 on the morning line, but it wouldn't surprise me if he's 7 or 8-1. And I actually think his really good tactical ability that you can put him anywhere and he's going to run his race is a big asset in this field. So I'm leaning towards Annapolis right now.
I guess the one knock against Annapolis is he got such a perfect trip last time in that turf mile at Keeneland, but he does seem like the kind of horse that can make his own good trips with that versatile running style that he has. So I don't want to be too hard on him for that because, as you said, a 3-year-old that is moving forward like that, I mean, he could arguably take another step forward here, and that would make him awfully dangerous. This is one, I mean, let me say ahead of time, I think Nick did a great job with these morning lines. It's a tough thing to do to get these all ready ahead of time before you see the post positions, to get everything out for these 2 days in just a matter of hours. It's not an enviable assignment. But the one that I was really surprised about was this line on Annapolis. I feel like he has to be the second choice in this race. I'd be surprised if he's that much higher than Kinross. Maybe the post position has something to do with it, but it's not like Kinross drew great here either. And with Irad Ortiz aboard and the connections, I was almost sure he'd be the second choice in this race. Maybe I'll be wrong about that. We'll see. But it's not like anybody can be that short a price, Craig, just given how wide open this race is. I'll mention some others that I was interested in. I mean, if Regal Glory is 6-1 and Annapolis is 10-1, I'd prefer Annapolis. I feel like those prices could be flip-flopped, though. Regal Glory is a horse that I don't want to overlook in this race because I know she's lost twice in a row, but I feel like she hasn't had the best setups either time. She was on the wrong part of that inner turf course 2 back at Saratoga when she was wide most of the way, when the rail was the place to be. I thought she ran deceptively well in that 4-star Dave. And then last time she couldn't catch an Italian, but in Italian has been on a tear for Chad Brown, and she was also the lone speed in that race with nobody pressing her. I think Regal Glory, some people might jump off the bandwagon here, but I don't think she's necessarily lost anything in her last couple of defeats, and if she can work out a trip in here, I'm not convinced that she isn't of this class.
I have no problems with Regal Glory at all. It's just, as you mentioned at the very beginning of that, it's going to come down to the price and what kind of prices they are. I'll admit I haven't had the chance to go and watch the replays for all the other European shipping in. I will do that in the coming week, obviously. But any of those jump out at you as horses who could give Modern Games a run?
Yeah, let me say ahead of time, I have not finalized my picks on the mile yet. I'm going to be doing that over the next day or two. I'll probably head right up until the deadline, which I typically do with my picks. But the Europeans are a tough group to figure out in here because aside from Modern Games, there's nobody that really fits this race perfectly. And maybe that's another reason why Modern Games is going to get bet down in here as we think he might be. I mean, Kinross has been in amazing form, but he really is more of a 6 to 7 furlong horse, and he's had his success in such a short period of time recently while that ground has gotten softer to yielding in Europe, and it feels like maybe the ground has moved him up a little bit as opposed to him just taking a big step forward on form. So I'm not quite sure what to do with him, and since I'm a little on the fence, the 13 post position just kind of convinces me to go in a different direction. Dreamloper is one that's coming in off a huge race last time at Longchamp, but her 2 performances at Longchamp kind of stand out in her career. Those 2 Group 1 wins in the Prix d'Ispahan earlier in the year, and then last time out in the mile race, that was also a race that featured a very unfortunate breakdown of the favorite. So maybe you don't want to put as much stock as you were going to in that 5+ length margin of victory. I'm not really sure what to do with her, and the Euro that I'm kind of warming up to a little bit at a huge price, Craig, is the number 1 Pogo. Maybe I'm off my rocker here because he's another horse that probably wants to go a little shorter than this, but he's really that 7 a furlong to a mile specialist, whereas Kinross maybe wants to go even a little bit shorter. And Pogo drew a great post position here. If you watch his races in Europe, he is one that you don't have to worry about having gait problems because he just busts out of the starting gate like he is ready to go every time. I've watched a bunch of his races and he is an awesome gait horse. The concern is that he's a bit of a front runner, but he's sat off horses in the past. I don't think he's going to be on the lead here, but I think he's going to be slotted just in behind the leaders. On time form ratings, he's just a tick below some of the top rated horses in here, like Dream Loper, like Kinross, Modern Games, maybe if you take him off his Woodbine Form 2 back. But I feel like he's going to get completely ignored in this race, Craig, and I just think the right trip is coming for this horse, and he's one that does act on firmer ground. So Pogo is one that I'm going to be looking to have somewhere in the mix. I don't know if he's my top pick, but I feel like he's value in this race.
I've learned over the years, particularly in this Breeders' Cup Mile, you don't want to overlook the Euros that are getting overlooked, if that makes sense, because we've seen a lot of them run very well at big prices.
There's some evidence right in this race in the entry box as Order of Australia is back for another go at the Breeders' Cup Mile. We didn't mention him, but he certainly has won this race at Keeneland at a big price before. Let's move on to another race that's likely to feature a favorite that a lot of people will be leaning on, the Sprint, Jackie's Warrior. No, Craig, we already covered this one pretty well. I think we've kind of alluded to our thoughts here. Unless there's some unforeseen mishap with Jackie's Warrior, like there was in the Sprint last year when he came out of the race with a knee chip, he's really supposed to beat this field.
He is. He's got everything going his way. I think the three horses most likely to beat him didn't show up in Jack Christopher and the two horses that went to the Dirt Mile and Gunite and the horse who beat him last time, Cody's Wish. So I'm not sure if you don't like him, if you're skeptical of that last race. Where do you latch on to? The only horse I could maybe come up with was Aloha West, the horse that won this race last year. But we haven't seen him since early July. I'm not sure what happened with him. I'll do my research on it. He's recently returned to the work tab just in October, so not this month now since we're recording this. On the 1st, he's worked out 5 times, but it just seems like a stretch. I know Kamari was entered in here. She's in really good form right now, but it's hard for me to see her being good enough to beat Jackie's Warrior unless he just throws a dud like last year. And as you said, I think he really did have an excuse last year.
The one thing I'll say about Kimari that might want to make you give her a second look in this race, Craig, is if you just scan through her past performances, she's a horse that does her best work in slow-paced races. For whatever reason, when the pace is fast, she just has to work a little bit too hard to stay close to it and seems to not possess that finish that she does have when she can just sit off a much slower early tempo. And the way that she's finished her last 2 races with slow paces, if she's within a couple lengths of Jackie's Warrior at the top of the stretch, you know that she can motor home. So I think with Jackie's Warrior, they've got to be careful to not go too slowly on the front end. And I know this is something that you've talked about quite a bit in the past. You don't want to take away these sprinters' best weapon. So I think the big danger with Kamari is letting her get into the race too much.
I agree with that 100%, and I think you could even argue that's what happened to Jackie's Warrior last time. It's that he went a little bit too slow. He was able to get away with it in the Vanderbilt in a race that was only 6 furlongs, and the runners up and third place finishers were knee-deep in snow and Willie Boy. But when he faced Cody's Wish, a horse who genuinely has some kick, and particularly at that 7 furlongs, he just couldn't quite hold him off because he didn't open up a big enough gap. Kamari, my only real knock is the price. She's 4-1 on the morning line, second choice, and I have no argument with that. I think she will be, and I think that's a little bit on the underlaid side, but I do view her as a strong contender and probably the second most likely winner. I just don't think she's going to offer any value.
Yeah, I thought I was going to be a way more against Kamari than I actually am when I looked at this race. I see the path to victory for her. I don't know if it's going to materialize, but I agree. She's the second most likely winner of this race. Let's move on to Golden Pal as we're backtracking through this Saturday card, Craig. You know, this is a tough one because we just talked about the pace situation, how he's likely to have things his own way once again as he seeks his 3rd consecutive Breeders' Cup victory. And I've been pretty on the record that I don't think Golden Pal is quite the same horse this year, especially in the second half of the season, that he's been in the past. But I guess the question is, does he need to be to win this race?
If he's not, I think you could very well make an argument that his stablemate, the filly Campanelli, is going to give him everything he wants in the stretch. She's not as fast as him early, but she does fly late. The one time that we saw her lose at Keeneland, it was over a soft course. Lose recently, I should say, here in the States. It was over a soft course. She was just taken way back off the pace for some unknown reason other than that's what Joel Rosario does on occasion. It didn't work out that day, but the switch to Irad Ortiz, he's ridden her perfectly, and I think she's actually a real danger to her stablemate.
I agree with that. I think the list of horses that can win this turf sprint is actually pretty short, but I believe there are 4 horses in this race that are major contenders. Obviously, Golden Pal is one of them, and I'm not gonna completely throw him out. I haven't lost my mind, but I do hold on to that opinion that he's not quite the same horse that he's been in the past. I was not taken with his recent victory at Keeneland, even though it was a course record, extremely fast time. Visually, it was not the same dominant Golden Pal that we've seen at different points in the past, at least from my perspective. I agree about Campanelli, Craig. I think she's very dangerous in here. I wouldn't want to throw out Casa Creed. I mean, I think turning back might be the right move for this horse. I was thinking they'd go in the mile, but they've decided to turn back in the turf sprint. And if he can avoid getting outrun in the early stages, he's got quite the closing kick, and that long stretch at Keeneland could work to his advantage. I know he doesn't have the flashy speed figures of a few others in here, but Casa Creed is a really talented horse, and I don't want to overlook him in here. And then there's Highfield Princess, Craig, and I did a live video with Marcus Hirsch last week, and he always has some strong feelings about these European contenders as one that really follows the overseas racing throughout the year. And I kind of was agreeing with him that if Highfield Princess brings her best race over to the U.S., everybody else might be running for second here.
Yeah, she's one that's tough to get a handle for me. My personal opinion is that when these sprinters from overseas ship here, their time form ratings are a little inflated. I don't want to get into a whole long discussion of speed figure making, but I don't think the sprinters are as strong as the milers and the longer horses, but they probably equate them. The best sprinters are going to get the same ratings as the best milers. We have something similar here, where the best sprinters, maybe not this year, but in years past, we're really good at sprinting and shorter distance races, and the longer we get, they get weaker, and we probably tend to overrate those a little bit, and we see it with shippers. But that said, her ratings are so good, even if they're overrated 4 or 5 points, it would still make her a contender.
And I think the noteworthy thing about Highfield Princess is her consistency. I mean, the one thing that you often don't see with these Europeans coming over for the turf sprints is consistency, because the turf sprinters in Europe, it's so dependent on the ground, the types of courses. It's not like they're all going 5 furlongs around one turn on a mile track. Over there, there's undulating ground, there's uphill. They're not going around a turn usually in these 5 or 6 furlong races, but the courses can be very different and play differently, and they run over all different types of weather situations. And Highfield Princess has just been consistently improving throughout the year. I mean, she's just reached a new level now as she's returned as a 5-year-old mare, and she is doing so well right now. I do not want to discount her, and she's a horse that travels very strongly in her races. She's not one of these horses that has to come from too far back, so as long as she can break well, I think she's pretty dangerous in here, Craig. I know that she's got some things to prove, but I do not want to overlook her, and for me, she's one of the 4 that can certainly win. Let's move on to the Friday races as we talk about some of these horses that are going to take the most money, the favorites that we might be looking to fade or try to lean on heavily in these races. We haven't talked too much about the Juvenile Turf yet, Craig, the final race on that Friday card, and I think we're going to have a pretty clear-cut favorite in here in the number 4, Silver Knot. Obviously, Charlie Appleby has an excellent record in North America in general in the Breeders' Cup, but especially in this Juvenile Turf. It's a race that he's won multiple times in the past, and Silver Knot just seems like he might be coming in with the best form of anybody.
Yeah, as you used earlier, I haven't lost my mind. I would not say that Silver Knot is not a legitimate favorite. He certainly is. Maybe there's some others in here that can beat him. Maybe he'll be overbet, but I think the morning line nailed it. He is definitely the horse to beat, even in a 14-horse field. He has the time form ratings to win this race. He's got the connections. the way he runs his races, he drew inside, he has decent tactical speed, so it's hard for me to find any knocks at all on him.
I agree with that. I've liked all of his races, watching his replays. He was last of 3-2 back, but the horse that beat him came back to win a Group 1 race. He's been facing much better competition in Europe, was pretty gritty to win last time, seemed like the step up to a mile really suited him that day, and he's just drawn a great post position here. I think both of the European contenders in this race drew great post positions, both he and Victoria Road. It's kind of weird, Craig, that there were only 2 Euros in this race and 12 American runners. That's not what you typically see in a race like the Juvenile Turf, but I think both of the Europeans that came over for this race are fairly interesting. Obviously, Silverknot has the much stronger credentials, and he's strictly the one to beat in here, though I wouldn't overlook Victoria Road as another to consider because he's been improving pretty quickly for Aidan O'Brien.
Now, when I look at the morning line and I see the next 2 choices are I'm Very Busy and the winner is, it's hard for me to get too excited about that. I mean, they're fine. They haven't run particularly fast. I actually think Victoria Road is probably the second most likely winner.
Yeah, this was not a race where I was looking to get terribly creative, and I think we've got a pretty similar view of those Europeans. We already talked about Cave Rock, Craig. Let's keep this one short with the Juvenile. I'm not trying to beat Cave Rock. He just looks way too good for this field. I don't think that a 50-1 pace horse that's drawn the rail is going to be the thorn at his side.
No, and the pace projector, I kind of laid out the trip I expect. Him sitting right off that horse, his stablemate National Treasure tucked in behind, and I think it's just too good for these horses. There's some other decent runners in here. Obviously, Forte, it's not like he's that far off speed figure-wise, but I don't think this course is going to be the ideal setup for him with a horse like Cave Rock. It's one of those, as you say, it's not the short stretch of the mile races, I don't believe. No, maybe it is for the mile and the 16th.
Do
you remember?
It is.
Yeah, it is. So it's not going to be a lot of time to run him down, and I think he's probably going to be long gone anyway.
Well, we've already talked about the Platinum Queen as a favorite. I think we're going to get to the Juvenile Fillies Turf in just a second when we talk about some of our price ideas, at least I want to. So let's go into the third phase of our discussion, Craig, and talk about, on the Friday card, some price horses that we might want to consider. And let's begin with that Juvenile Turf Sprint, where I think we both expressed some skepticism about the Platinum Queen. I don't know, maybe you're a big fan of Love Reigns. We haven't really touched upon her yet, but is there anybody at a price that you're looking at in this race?
I mean, Love Reigns is fine. I don't have any big knocks. I'm not a big fan of that post with all the other speed in there. I wonder if she'll get shuffled back. One horse that I wouldn't be worried about getting shuffled back that I think's actually coming to hand nicely and is going to get a great setup is Private Creed. He's maybe not as fast as some of these others on speed figures yet, but it's hard to argue in a race, in a turf sprint no less, in a race that you figure is going to have a really fast pace, to have a guy like Joel Rosario on your horse. Sometimes he can drive you mad, but this is the kind of ride that I want Private Creed to get. If you said, give me one jockey to put on a closer in this race, it would obviously be him.
Yeah, I like Private Creed's running style. I'm not quite sure he's good enough, but you expressed that. He's got to get faster on speed figures. The trip could work out, and trips are of utmost importance in a race like this. Craig, I know that you're typically skeptical of the Europeans in races like the Juvenile Turf Sprint, where they haven't had that history of success, and the juveniles, the Americans, just tend to be a little faster than the Euros. But I think this is an odd situation where you've got a lot of speed signed on, and there are some Europeans in here that are going to appreciate some pace. And when I look through the American contenders, it seems like so many of them want to be forward. I have trouble finding that closer, and I think there are a couple of options among the Euros that are going to get the right kind of trips. They're drawn right in the middle of the field, the number 5 Mischief Magic and the number 6 Persian Force. And I mean, I hope the morning line holds up because I much prefer Persian Force. He's not a horse that comes from that far back in Europe. He's kind of more of a stalking type, but I think he's just going to naturally have to adapt his running style in a race like this to come from a little farther back in the pack. But I like his form overseas. He's been meeting some really good horses from the Aidan O'Brien barn. Little Big Bear is one of the early favorites for next year's 2,000 Guineas. Blackbeard was supposed to be in this race, but he got injured recently and has subsequently been retired. But he was one of the top-rated 2-year-olds in Europe, and Persian Force and Mischief Magic were right there with him last time in the Middle Park, and Persian Force has been more competitive with that foe previously, and I just like his races, and watching them overseas, I get the sense that if anything, 6 furlongs has been a bit too far for him. I think he's going to really appreciate this turn back to 5.5, and with Frankie Dettori aboard, I don't know if we're going to get 15-1, but anything above 6-1 I think is going to be good value on Persian Force.
The one thing I'll say about the Euros is I think they're coming over with better and better resumes. It's just a matter of time until one of them wins this Juvenile Turf Sprint. I think we've already seen a filly win the Turf Sprint. That might have been at Santa Anita, which kind of more of a European horse, if I remember right. I could be wrong about that. But the thing is, they are getting better and better, so they're not as easy to dismiss as I have done in the past.
Well, Craig, let's go on to the Juvenile Fillies. We talked about the fast pace of this race. I'm not a big fan of Chocolate Gelato. Maybe she'll be the favorite by default here. I think she'll be a lukewarm one if she is favored. I don't know. I was not super taken with her Frisette last time. I know it was a muddy track, but she just didn't finish off that race to me. Like, added distance is going to be her friend. And this just seems like a totally wide open race where you can make a case for almost anybody.
I agree. It's not that I have huge knocks on Chocolate Gelato. I don't see any value there at all. She hasn't run all that fast. We don't know if how she's going to really handle the 2 turns. So I think there's a lot of directions you could go in here. It just, when you look at the speed figures, like I just looked down the preview page on TimeformUS, you get a couple horses in the low hundreds, a lot of horses in the mid to upper 90s, and this just seems like a race that trips are going to matter a lot and the flow of the race, and I'm not sure it's going to work out very well for Chocolate Gelato from that far outside.
Yeah, this is another race where I haven't quite settled on a pick yet. I will say I'm strongly considering the number 9 Grand Love. I know I previewed this a little bit earlier. She's 20-1 on the morning line. I don't know what kind of price she's going to be. I think the minimum for me on a horse like her would probably be about 12-1 if this field holds together, because I do want to do some price shopping in this race. I was really taken with her debut at Saratoga, Craig. I thought she ran extremely well that day, surviving a fast pace, turning back some foes, and finishing well. I know she came back and ran poorly on the stretch out the 2 turns in that Pocahontas last time. That was a pace that was fairly honest, and there was another horse that she was dueling with that also faded a little bit, I think, to finish 5th. That horse came back and had won at Keeneland recently, so maybe her trip was a little tougher than it even seemed at the time. And the fact that she's running back here for Steve Asmussen and not targeting something else, I feel like that's probably a good sign. Her pedigree says that 2 turns is supposed to be no problem. It actually says she's supposed to be better going longer because her siblings, Valid and Malibu Prayer, they were dirt routers strictly. So I think she's a little interesting here, and I would imagine that they're not going to mess around. I mean, they've got nothing to lose on her here, so they're just going to go forward, try to get to the lead, and maybe wire this field. And sometimes in races with a lot of speed, the best place to be is out of trouble on the front end.
I was surprised, as I mentioned, that she was entered in here, and like you, I kind of hinted at it earlier. I took that as a good sign. We saw a very similar horse in Echo again kind of take that. He really disappointed on that very same day at Churchill in the Iroquois at a very short price, and he was brought back in a race a couple days ago. Now, unfortunately, there was a spill in that race. It didn't. It wound up being declared a no contest. But he could have just as easily ran Echo again back in this race in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, and he chose not to. So that really did make me take note with Grand Love, and she's one that I'm interested in as well. As for the rest, none really stood out. It just seems like such a wide open race. I do think you got to give a long look to that race at Keeneland last time, the race that was won by Wonder Wheel, who's in here. Also, I think the 2, 3, 4 finishers are in here. And I'm probably not as high on that race as some people. I know I've seen a lot of talk about horses like Chop Chop, particularly Chop Chop and Raging Sea as horses who would be dangerous, but the way that race unfolded, I'm just not so sure, and that's why I'm probably going to look in different directions than the favorite and anybody coming out of that Alcebiades.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not sure how strong a race that was. I mean, the one that I kind of do want the most out of there is Raging Sea, just in general, because I feel like she's a filly that we haven't yet seen the best of, and she's one that ultimately is going to appreciate even more distance than this. Maybe everyone's going to go off her now that she's drawn post 14. That's definitely not where you want to be at a mile in the 16th race at Keeneland. However, it could mean that they just have to take her back in the early going and not even try to get forward. Maybe that's a good trip for her. We'll see, but it's definitely not going to be an easy one to work out for Flavie and Pratt. But again, it's a race where you do want to let price be your guide. I wouldn't want Raging Sea at 5-1, but if she drifts up to 10-1, maybe I could be enticed on her. But even a horse like Tell Me No Lies, who seems like she's a little too slow on paper, she's going to get another fast pace to close into. She's been consistent. She handles the 2 turns. I don't want to completely ignore a horse like her, even though she's a little slow coming in.
Yeah, this will be one I'm going to be looking at the board closely because somebody's going to slip through the cracks. I don't particularly like either of the top 2, even 3 choices. Wonder Wheel, even though she was very game, I can't envision her getting anywhere near that same wire-to-wire trip she got last time. So it's one where I'm going to be looking for some prices. It's just hard to tell exactly who they're going to be.
Well, Craig, the one race on Friday we haven't really touched upon yet is the Juvenile Fillies Turf. I guess the favorite in here is going to be the number 10, Meditate, who I have some questions about. I know that she's been of a higher class than a lot of the other Euros coming over for this race, just based on her form there, but she's primarily been racing 6 to 7 furlongs. From a pedigree standpoint, it's unclear if added ground is really going to suit her, being a daughter of No Nay Never. There's a bit more stamina on the dam side. Watching her races, I could go either way on her. I'm not sure that she's going to love the 2-turn mile. It seems like that could be stretching her to the limit. And if she is a short price, I would want to keep an open mind here.
Right, and at some point, and I know the last time this came up, and it may have been quite a while ago, we were both a little skeptical and wondered how much meaning it had, but I do think you have to start looking at Aidan O'Brien's record when he ships over here because, frankly, it really does stink. He just does not win very often. There's a lot of reasons for it. Maybe he's not sending his best horses, but, is Meditate one of his best? Probably not. So she's one I'm not very interested in from that outside post.
I mean, she was one of the best 2-year-old fillies in Europe earlier this year. I think that reputation has been tarnished a little bit by 2 straight losses in Group 1 company, but the horses that beat her in her 2 races recently, they're good horses, especially 2-back. Tahira is talked about as the early favorite for the Epsom Oaks next year. So, I mean, I think she's been beaten by good ones. I just question whether this is the right race for her. Craig, I was really looking forward to making a case for Kijera in here, the number 13. Unfortunately, she's the number 13. That's a really tough post position in this race with those tight turns at Keeneland, going the mile distance. I think on form, among the U.S. horses, she is the only one that I want because I feel like her maiden races over the summer at Saratoga are even better than what we've seen from some of the horses that ran in stakes this fall. It's just, I question whether she's going to work out the right trip from that post position.
Right, particularly with her running style because she's one who does have speed, and I don't know if you want to take that out of her, and maybe they get lucky and no one goes, but yeah, it's just not ideal. There's no 2 ways about it. Drawing the 13 hole is not good. One horse I did want to ask you about because I know you liked her last time, and I actually want to give her a look as Last Call, who comes in from Woodbine. I know the Natalma wasn't the strongest race we're ever going to see, but I'm not sure any of these are coming out of all that stronger races. When you look through our figures on the preview page, only Zajera has that 105. Everybody else is low hundreds, upper 90s. And I just really liked when I went back and watched how Last Call was able to finish off that race despite there being no pace whatsoever. So she's one who draws inside who I'm a little interested in and what's going to be a big price.
Yeah, Craig, I'm on the same page as you. I know that when you get these horses home at upwards of 20-1, you're supposed to be off them next time, but I feel like she's going to be around that price once again, and she projects to get a great trip from the inside. As you said, it's unclear that Natalma was any worse a race than the Jessamine or the Miss Grillo in New York, so I think she makes a lot of sense here, and she's one that, as I pointed out prior to the Natalma, she was slowly but surely figuring things out, and she's on an upward trend, so I think she's one that's interesting. And a horse in this race that I've been warming up to recently, Craig, is the number 7 Spirit Gal, who I think is going to get totally overlooked of the European contenders, and she interests me quite a bit. I know that she's a little slow on speed figures coming in here, but in that all-weather race last time at Dundalk, she beat a really good horse in Cairo, one that was pre-entered in the Juvenile Turf that Aidan O'Brien subsequently decided not to run, but I mean, she beat that male horse very easily, did it from the front end, and if you watch her races, she is a front runner, but doesn't feel like there's that much speed in this field as I go through it. If she can break alertly, which she's done in the past, she could potentially get forward here, and I know she's never gone farther than 7 furlongs, never farther than 6 furlongs on the turf, but the bottom side of her pedigree is all stamina breeding, and I think she's going to like going a little bit longer, and she's one that is just, she's just not going to take money in this race, and I think that she could fly under the radar.
Yeah, I've got no problem with her. I'm going to have to go watch those races if I can even find them. I don't know if I assume you did find them. But you did bring up a point that I only touched on a little bit with Zijera, that there's just not a lot of speed in here. And she's one that does have the fastest pace figure. It is still pretty or early speed rating, I should say. It would still be a task to clear from the 13 hole. But if she does it, as you said, you're not totally dismissing her. Her running style could help her now that I look at the rest of the field.
Yeah, they're probably going to be my top 2 picks in some order, Craig. Her and Gijera and Spirit Gal. I just kind of have to sort out how I'm going to do it. But I do want horses that can get some forward position in that race. I think we already talked about the last 2 races on Friday, Craig, the Juvenile Turf and the Juvenile pretty comprehensively. So let's move on to Saturday, and I'll hand it over to you wherever you want to start with just some price horses that we haven't yet mentioned.
Okay, I'll start with the Dirt Mile, and a horse I didn't expect to like. It's just a horse who was just kind of floating in the back of my head as I was wondering what race they were going to pick and where he'd show up. But I'm going with the BC Dirt Mile. It's a race we talked about where we think the pace is going to be pretty quick. And there's a 3-year-old in here who really caught my attention when I was looking at the past performances last night, and that's Simplification. He's a horse who has good tactical speed. He's basically, if you ask me, been running over his head for quite a long time now. I think this is a big drop in class. I don't think this is the strongest BC Dirt Mile we're ever going to see. There's certainly no Life is Good or Knicks Go in here. There's some good solid horses, but I just don't see why he can't be a strong contender in here. Despite, if you ignored his running lines and just look at his TimeformUS speed figures, he's getting better and better every single race, even though the results don't show it. And he's won at a 15-1 morning line and a good inside post with good tactical speed that just really caught my eye.
I'm definitely not going to talk you off a horse like that. There is the potential for him to work out the perfect trip in this race if he could not lose too much position heading into that clubhouse turn. I don't know if he's necessarily for me, but you do make some good points about him not being that far off some of the others, and he's definitely one that you can consider in the Dirt Mile. That's another race where I have not settled upon a pick yet. I was a little interested in Pipeline because I wonder if he could play out to be the speed of the speed, especially having drawn inside of horses like Gunite and Laurel River. So I feel like they're going to be pretty aggressive with him. He's got that natural 1 mile high cruising speed, and he ran very well in his last start. So I don't know what price he's going to be, but he's a horse that I was pretty interested in the Dirt Mile. Craig, I'll go back to the Fillies and Mares Sprint because I know we talked a little bit about being skeptical of Goodnight Olivis, the favorite. I'll mention a horse that I've been sort of warming up to, and maybe you can tell me if you think I'm crazy. This race feels like it's ripe to fall apart. Because there's just so much speed signed on. Of all the pace situations we talked about, it's hard to envision them slowing it down in the front end here because there are just so many horses that want to be forwardly placed. And if you're going through this race, I think the natural inclination is to go to obligatory, because she is a horse that is so dependent on pace. When she gets that really hot setup up front, she puts in quite the stretch run to get there, and it looks like she's pretty likely to get her preferred setup in this race. So I was initially looking at her, but as I was taking a deeper dive into this race, I was saying to myself, if I'm considering obligatory, why am I not taking a longer look at the Japanese contender Chain of Love, who is going to be a gigantic price in here? But if you go to watch her races, she is another one of these deep closers who wants to be running at the end of her races. You could check out her last replay. I know it's been posted on YouTube, but you can also check it out on the Japan Racing website. She makes a really impressive run from far back to get up by a nose to win that race. And I know it was just a listed stakes. They don't run graded stakes for dirt sprinters really in Japan, at least not on the JRA circuit. So don't be too deterred by the fact that she's not running in graded stakes in Japan. She's been facing good horses, and she raced in the Middle East over the winter time. She raced in Saudi Arabia, and also she ran pretty well in that Dubai Golden Shaheen at Meydan. I mean, she basically hit the wire with Dr. Scheibel, who maybe isn't among the best male turf sprinters out there, but I think it considered Dr. Scheibel a contender against this field of females. And Chain of Love, she had a bit of a tough trip in that race. If you just go back and watch some of her races, I think there are some things to recommend about her. And I know that people have been all about the Japanese horses winning international races throughout the season, but I feel like she's going to be a little bit more of a Marche Lorraine, is one that people aren't really considering seriously, as opposed to some of those that took a lot of money in other major international events.
I had two horses down that I would use in here if I thought this race is going to fall apart. And I do think it's going to fall apart. And they're the two that you mentioned. Obligatory, I'm not quite as warm on, just because I just don't trust her. I'm not sure the fields when she wins have been all that good. But she's going to be coming late, so I don't want to totally dismiss her. I don't want to rehash everything you said about Chain of Love. I think there is a lot to like about her. I did go back and watch those Meydan and Saudi Arabia races. I thought they were both pretty solid, actually. And I think she's going to be a real threat in here. One more horse I want to mention, and you're probably going to fall off your chair, that I actually like a bit in here is Frank's Rocket. A horse who seems like I've spent about 3 seasons trying to beat over and over, and mostly being pretty successful about it. But I don't know what's happened with this filly. The last 2 races, it seems to me like she's really turned a corner. Something's clicked. The light bulbs went on. She's not a horse who has to be involved in the speed duel. She seems like she's running her fastest races, so I don't want to totally dismiss her in this spot. She's one I actually think has a pretty good shot.
Well, you could knock me over with a feather, Craig. Yeah, I can't deny it. She's gotten better recently. Like you, I've never been her biggest fan, as you know. You've probably been a more vocal detractor than I've been. But it does seem like she's taken a step forward recently. So I don't know what we're going to get from her as she steps back up into tougher company in this Fillies and Mares Sprint. We've already talked about a lot of these Saturday races, Craig. One that we haven't really spent any time on is the Fillies and Mares Turf. It doesn't really have a clear heavy favorite. I mean, Nashua is probably going to be the public choice. This is one where I think the Euros are going to have a pretty big say. What do you make of the American contender in Italian? I mean, she does seem like she has the best resume of the U.S. trained runners. And, maybe we should have talked about this race with regard to pace situations, because it doesn't seem like there's anybody to challenge her on the front end.
I don't think the 11 post is going to hurt her one bit, because who's going to go with her? I have no idea. The horse we have shown on the pace projector second last ran in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies and Mares Turf and really wasn't that much of a factor. And we're putting her second based on that race where she wasn't even that close to the pace early, wasn't a fast pace. So it does seem like an Italian's going to have things her own way. That said, a mile and a 3/16, it just feels like that really has to be pushing her upper limits. I know she wanted a mile and an eighth in the Diana. It seemed like she was pretty tired at the end of that race. She was being chased home by 2 stablemates, Technical Analysis and Bleecker Street, neither of whom I think are really grade 1 horses. I think the First Lady last time at a mile is probably much more closer to her ideal distance. So despite that tactical edge, I'm probably going to look to beat an Italian in here. And one of the horses I would do it with is a Euro, but it's the other Euro in Tuesday. She's a 3-year-old filly who she doesn't quite stack up if you look at her time form ratings. But I've talked about those time form ratings quite a bit when you're talking 2 and 3-year-olds. I think they're a little bit underrated when you compare them to our speed figures. And when you look back, her last 2 races have come on courses that I don't think are really to her liking. She seems to do her best running on good to firm courses. That's probably what she's going to get on Keeneland. So she's one I'm going to give a long look, despite that record I talked about for Maiden O'Brien.
Yeah, this is a race where I don't want to speak with too much conviction because I still have some work to do on it. I will say I'm leaning towards the shorter priced horses, the ones that are listed at less than 10 to 1 on the morning line. I think there are 4 of those. In Italian can certainly win this race. I'm not against her by any means. I have the same questions as Craig, though I think if the pace sets up the right way, she'll probably get the distance. Of the Euros, I think I'm leaning towards above the curve, but like I said, I have more to do on this race, and she just seemed like one that has a little more upside than the others as the lightly raced runner coming in. And I've liked the visual and the fight that she's displayed in some of her recent races, but I have not solidified my picks in the Filly and Mare Turf yet. And Greg, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the one race that we haven't really spent any time on yet that we should wrap up this podcast with is the Breeders' Cup Turf. Difficult to predict who's going to be favored in this race. I was interested to see Nick's morning line. I can't say that I disagree strongly with it because I don't really have a strong idea of who they're going to go for. I think both Charlie Appleby runners are likely to take money. And I think Warlike Goddess could also vie for favoritism here. They're the 3 favorites, She, Rebels, Romance, and Nation's Pride. But as I go through here, it just doesn't feel like the strongest edition of the Breeders' Cup Turf that we've ever seen, so I want to keep an open mind.
Yeah, I haven't finalized any picks here. It's hard for me to get too excited about those. I mean, Warlike Goddess, we've said all along the 1.5 miles will be perfect. We both kind of wanted her to try males where she was likely to get more pace. She did, and she delivered, but it's not like she has speed figures that tower over the field in here. Rebels Romance, I'm going to have to spend some time. His record looks great. He's a horse that we saw win the UAE Derby, and many thought he was going to come to the Kentucky Derby. Things didn't work out. He moved to turf, and things have went swimmingly. But I wonder how strong those races really were. The last 2 were in Germany. It's one I'm going to have to study. The time form ratings aren't all that strong for him. So even though it's Charlie Appleby, it's hard for me to get too excited about him. And even the same goes for Nation Pride. I mean, he's been good. We've seen him here in the States his last 3 times. He arguably could have won that Turf Triple Crown on the Naira circuit with a better trip in the first race, but it's not the strongest fields there either. The best horse he beat was Annapolis, and he was probably going too far that day. So I'm not sure what directions I'm going to get. My initial pass through, the horse that kind of jumped out at me was Mishrif. He's a horse who we know can win top-class races. He won the Saudi race, and he also won a Group 1 in Meydan right after that. He kind of looks off form based on that arc, but that was a course. Who knows how he liked it. I think he wants a little more firmness in the ground than what we saw there. So if you're willing to forgive that race, you could make the argument Mishrif is the horse to beat.
We pretty much agree, Craig. I have very little to add about what you said. I mean, I think with the 2 Appleby runners, the one point I would make is it's somewhat interesting that his top stable jockey, William Buick, is on Nation's Pride instead of the horse that he's been riding all year, Rebels Romance. I think some people were surprised to see that jockey change at the last second, and maybe that speaks to the fact that Nation's Pride is the preferred one. I don't know. I think Nation's Pride is going to take a lot of money just because Yabir won this race last year, looking like he came in with a similar profile. I don't think that's a good reason for this horse to be a short price, and I think he does have to improve a little bit because he's been facing much, much weaker competition, even though he did beat Annapolis 2 back. I just thought that was too far for Annapolis. So I'm not that convinced on either of the Appleby runners. I think they're both a little overrated coming in here. And of the Euros, I agree. Mishriff, there's nothing wrong with his form from the summertime. I know that he disappointed in his last couple, but I think the ground had everything to do with that. He's a horse that really needs firmer ground, and when he got that earlier in the year, he ran much better. So I think as he concludes his career here, he's one that could go out with a bang in this Breeders' Cup Turf. And Craig, I thought I was going to be more against Warlike Goddess than I ultimately am. She can definitely win this race. I know that often you want to be skeptical of the Americans because often in the turf, there are Euros that come over that just look so formidable, but Warlike Goddess, I mean, she was dominant last time, albeit not against the best turf males, but she gets this distance. I mean, she's a strong finisher. She drew a great post position. I am certainly not against her.
No, I'm not either. She's 100% the best American horse in this field. I don't even think that's a real argument in here. We're talking about horses like Red Knight, who's fine. I'd love to own Red Knight, but I think we'd mostly be shocked if he were to win a race like this. I will say it's cool to see Channel Maker made the Breeders' Cup once again. I know we talked about it, and it looked like it might be skeptical that he was going to do it, but this is how many for him now? 6 that he's going to make?
It's his 6th of Breeders' Cup in total. I believe his 5th consecutive. I think he didn't start as a 3-year-old, but he ran the Juvenile Turf as a 2-year-old, and I think he's been in the turf in 5 consecutive years. So he is just a really cool horse.
Yeah, and don't be surprised if he's not up near the front early. I don't think he'll be there late. But as for winning, yeah, I'm with you. Warlike Goddess is fine. I wouldn't surprise me at all if she wins. It's one you have to keep an eye on the tote board because I think she might get a little overbet just as the best American, and I think the Euros are probably a little better. But as you said, it's not the strongest crop we've ever seen come over.
Yeah, and I mean, if I'm trying to get more creative, I'm probably looking towards horses like Stone Age and Broom, but as Craig already pointed out, it can be hard to trust these Aidan O'Brien runners at times, though if I'm going to take a shot with ones, they'll be at least bigger prices as opposed to Meditate, who's going to be the favorite in that Juvenile Fillies Turf. So they're the two that I'm considering upgrading. Again, I've got to do a little bit more work on this race and kind of finalize my opinions, but I was having trouble arriving at an angle that really took a stand against the favorites. So the Breeders' Cup Turf just seems like a race that didn't come up as strong as we've seen in some past years. Well, Craig, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we've covered just about everything that we need to on this podcast. It's a long one, so thank you if you made it to the end of this. But we tried to look at these races from different angles that I think people can use when they do their own handicapping and given out some of our preliminary price ideas. I know at this point, Craig, I'm just going to try to take one last pass through these races, try to get these opinions finalized, and then I'll just be looking forward to Friday and Saturday because it should be 2 excellent days of racing.
Yep, and I have the good fortune to be able to go this year. I'm really looking forward to it, particularly that Distaff and the Classic. I've never had the good fortune to see a Flightline race. I'm looking forward to that. There's a lot of horses on these cards I've never seen race, so it's going to be fun. And I do think you made a great point, and I'll close out with this. It's great to do your work and kind of get to the horses you like and envision the pace scenarios. And the good thing about that for me is you get to spend the time, we get these PPs so early, is that when the race days come, you can kind of focus on the tote board. You've already had your opinions, and now you get to see which ones are going to offer value. And the thing I love about the Breeders' Cup is so many good horses are going to get overlooked, because a lot of very good horses will get overbet, and they're not all going to win. That's a given.
That's a really good point, Craig, and I think you said it much better than I did. The Breeders' Cup is a time to really keep an open mind about price, and there are always horses that slip through the cracks in these races. Well, Craig, I hope that you have a great time at Keeneland. Enjoy these Breeders' Cup races on Friday and Saturday, and I'm sure you'll enjoy seeing Flightline, as everybody else will. He's quite the sight to behold in person, so that's going to be really exciting to see him close out his year in the Breeders' Cup Classic. So everybody, whether you're going to the Breeders' Cup or not, I hope you enjoy enjoy these 2 days of racing at Keeneland on Friday and Saturday. This will be our only podcast this week. Obviously, we're doing this forecast early to focus on the Breeders' Cup. No podcast later this week, but we will be returning next week to talk about some of these races and, of course, do a Breeders' Cup recap show. So, everybody, thanks for listening. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Good luck at the Breeders' Cup.